Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So good morning. My name is Anthony Opapari. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Michigan and a member of the Laboratory for Progress. And so on behalf of myself, my co-authors, I'm really excited to be here. It's my first conference, actually. And I'm going to be presenting on our work, Differentiable Nonparametric Belief Propagation. So in this project, we were really interested in robotic perception for uncertain environments. And so in particular, when we think about uncertain environments, we typically think about pose estimation where we have a lot of occlusion within the environment or noisy sensor data. So broadly, there have been two very successful classes of techniques applied within perception for uncertain environments. So on the one hand, we have generative probabilistic inference. So on the left side, I'll play a clip that's actually from a project that came out of our lab a few years ago where we applied belief propagation algorithm to pose estimation of this fetch robot given noisy point cloud data. And so generative probabilistic inference and data-driven neural networks would be the other broad class of approaches. They both have advantages and disadvantages. So for probabilistic inference, the algorithms tend to be what we call diagnosable. So that is, from a probabilistic perspective, we can interpret the algorithms, and with all of their estimates, we'll have some measure of uncertainty that goes along with the output. One downside, though, with these approaches is that they tend to be very expensive. So from a computational standpoint, the algorithms tend to be very expensive to actually compute the probability distributions that are output. But also from a domain knowledge perspective, it's typically very difficult to design these probabilistic models. On the data-driven neural network side, though, they tend to have very complementary trade-offs. So whereas probabilistic inference is slow, data-driven neural networks tend to be very scalable. So you can apply them to large data sets and to new unseen data sets without much domain knowledge. But on the downside, though, they tend to be inexplicable. And so in this project, we were really interested in trying to understand whether or not we could sort of bring these two like advantages of both of them together to achieve the best of both. And so if we think about where this idea fits into the sort of trends that we see within the field, what we typically would see historically is that probabilistic inference algorithms would be implemented as an expert model-based paradigm, where you'd have some expert with a complex probabilistic model. So in this case, on the left-hand side, the probabilistic graphical model is using known observed features from the environment and known models about how the domain sort of operates. And at that point, then neural networks have kind of become very, very popular. And so what we see now is that a labeled data set will typically take the place of what would have been a domain expert in the past. And these labeled data sets then are used to iteratively train the neural network. And so what we see as a really exciting direction for future work is to try and bring these two worlds together. So we could still have a labeled data set. So we need less domain knowledge, but trying to capture those advantages of the probabilistic inference algorithms. And so our goal in this project was to try and minimize and potentially eliminate the costly handcrafting that typically would go into belief propagation as one particular example of a probabilistic inference algorithm. So we're not the only people thinking along these lines. So there's been a lot of recent, really exciting work kind of trying to apply learning for graphical models. So I can't cover all of them, but I've highlighted a few on this slide that were inspirations for this project. And in particular, I'd point out the differentiable particle filter was really a key source of inspiration for our thinking in this work. The one thing, though, that we tried to kind of extend was, and try and understand, is if we could extend some of these ideas where you'd replace certain functions within a particle filter to higher dimensional spaces where we would still want to do inference. And so we targeted belief propagation as an interesting algorithm with a lot of benefits that we could target. So at a high level, this is the approach that we introduced in this paper. So we call it differentiable nonparametric belief propagation. And we looked at articulated object pose estimation as the problem that we were interested in applying it to. So the way that this model gets applied is there's typically some unobserved data that we want to model. So in the case of articulated object pose estimation, we could take trying to estimate the pose of the human hand as an interesting problem. So we would model that as a probabilistic graphical model where the 21 joints, let's say on the human hand in 3D space, would be unobserved, but our robot would have some visual information like an image or a depth image that it could try and use to understand where the unobserved variables are. And so belief propagation will encode that probabilistic graphical model into what's called the joint probability density function. And then by applying the belief propagation algorithm, you'll get on the far right-hand side, like an estimate of the pose of each of the individual parts conditioned on that observed data. And so what we did in this project that's a little bit different is we would insert then differentiable neural networks to replace what would have been those handcrafted probabilistic functions in the joint PDF, and then use backpropagation and gradient descent to train the individual neural networks. And so the training objective in this application is we try and train the network parameters to maximize the belief at the ground truth location of each of the parts posed that we're interested in. And so we then looked at two applications of this proposed algorithm in this project. So the first one that I'll highlight was a simulated data set where we try and track the pose of an articulated pendulum. So in this case, we have color images coming into our model, and then they're fed through our differentiable nonparametric belief propagation algorithm. We train the algorithm to try and estimate the pose of the dumbbell pendulum in space as it swings amidst clutter. And then we would apply the model at test time to unseen sequences. And so I'll highlight one result. So I'm going to play these two videos side by side. So on the left-hand side is going to be the pendulum swinging in a case where there's no occlusion. And then on the right-hand side, that same pendulum is swinging, but the orange or sort of pink square that we've added in the center is an occluding sort of obstacle that would obstruct our robot's vision. And so the really nice result that we see is that in the case of occlusion, our model has higher uncertainty precisely at the time steps in which the pendulum is occluded. So the uncertainty in this case is modeled in the line charts below each of the swinging pendulums, and we measure that by entropy. So the next problem then that we looked at was human hand tracking. So in this case, it's a more realistic, non-synthetic data set where we have depth images come into our model. We follow that same training and then testing process. And in this case, the dimensionality of the problem is much larger with 21 individual unobserved variables. And so I'll highlight one particular sequence qualitative output that we have here. And I'd point out the third and the fourth column of the results here, where on the third column, we show the ground truth pose of the human hand overlaid on the depth image. And then the fourth column shows our estimate. And so the main takeaway here is that it's showing evidence that our model DMBP can be applied successfully to a more realistic robotic pose estimation task. And in particular, a task where for robot adoption, having a measure of uncertainty, which our model provides, would be really crucial to avoid making catastrophic errors by the robot. And so in conclusion, we presented this differentiable nonparametric belief propagation algorithm, and then we showed two qualitative outputs, one where the output uncertainty by DMBP was promising for noisy environments, and then a second example of a more realistic pose estimation task where DMBP was successful. And I think we have a few minutes for questions, potentially. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Thank you.